Okay, class, we'll have a look at chapter 15 today now. It has to do with as you can see right up at the top of the page there, page 1 of chapter 15. It has to do with processing information and intersections, curves, hills, and passing and being passed, which is very important because, as we mentioned, I think earlier, there's always an element of danger when we're passing other vehicles. So we'll talk a bit about those things now. The first thing they mentioned there is observing, and remember we talked about the OEA driving strategy before, observing, evaluating, and acting on whatever the scenario, whatever case might be. So the first thing they talk about with the urban and rural environment there is read at the bottom of the page there, of chapter 15, page 1 there, they talk about the road lanes and road widths and lane markings and roadway surfaces and shoulder conditions, slope and off the road and shoulder, curb types and height, hills, curves and intersections. We have to contend with all of those things when we're driving actually. Excess of limited visibility, areas of limited visibility, and structures adjacent to the roadway. So all those things we have to contend with, class, when we're driving and keep our eyes moving, as we have mentioned already now. And you notice they mention in the second paragraph there on page 1 to your right there, they say a suggested pattern would be to scan far ahead 20 to 30 seconds. Then closer 12 to 15 seconds. Well, depending on our speed, as we mentioned, from around town driving up to 50 kilometers an hour, we scan 12 to 15 seconds, and that way you can identify a hazard. And we did mention that on highway driving, of course, we're driving at a much higher speed. Well, then, of course, we would probably need a 15 or 20 to 30 second eye lead time, so to speak, because we're driving at a greater speed and we want to see farther ahead so that we can react to a hazard that might be in our intended path. And we did mention the moose as an example there. It's a lot of people have to be confronted with, for sure, moose vehicle collisions. So, on the next page there, they talk about the urban rural environment, signs, signals, and markings to scan for. Those are selective things that we talked about. Warning signs, regulatory signs, directional signs, and informational signs. And all those we talked about back in chapter 2, if you recall. Now we were bombarded with lane markings and arrows and road signs and that sort of thing. Motorized vehicles to scan for. Well, every day we see cars and SUVs and minivans on the road, trucks and tractor trailers and buses and taxis and motorhomes, particularly summertime. Motorcycles and motorized scooters, that would be more summer used vehicles, of course. Construction equipment, farm vehicles and tractors, and others. We don't see a lot of farm tractors on our roadways. Once in a while, probably we see them, but not often. And other slow-moving equipment, which sometimes road repair equipment, or even tractor trailers when they're approaching hills, they're very slow-moving sometimes, and usually there's a passing lane that we can use in those cases to get along with these slow-moving vehicles. Non-motorized road users, well, of course, pedestrians and bicyclists and skaters and skateboarders and horse-drawn equipment. Again, we don't see a lot of it, but seldom. Once in a while you may see that type of road user. And animals, well, particularly moose that we mentioned several times now. And of course, pets, animals, cats, dogs could be on the roadway as well. And sometimes animals like ducks crossing the roadways here and there near parks and ponds and that sort of thing. So those are things that use the road sometimes, and we have to be vigilant of, for sure. So at the bottom of page 2 there, you notice there's they talk about the vehicle in the space area again, and we already saw a picture of that earlier in the chapter there, whereby we've got the right front and the the center of the vehicle, and of course the left front. Same thing with the rear, right rear, left rear, and directly behind the vehicle. So those are the spaces that you have to look for to keep your vehicle in a safe position. And of course, your mirrors can show you a lot of these areas as well. And if we have a rear vision camera, particularly when we're reversing, we can also see clearly behind our vehicle as well. So those are the zones that that our vehicle needs extra space for, class, and away from other vehicles, and away from pedestrians, of course, and buildings or fences or guardrails, whatever the case might be there. So they say you can evaluate, can you move your vehicle towards area 2 safely? You know, that will be in another lane there. It's all about observing, class, you know, and if it's safe to do so, you act on that particular situation there. Decision making, as we say, this is just one simple example of observing, scanning, and identifying. And the steps to evaluate and predict and decide, are those things safe to do, or can I be involved in a collision here? You know, that's the thing there. That's what they're talking about, and referring to that picture at the bottom of page 2 there on chapter 15. So page 3 there of chapter 15, you notice they talk about intersections again, and we've already discussed to some degree about intersections and stop signs and traffic lights and those sorts of things at intersections. So at the bottom of page 3 there, they show you a big intersection there where you've got 2 lanes to make a right turn and 2 lanes where you can make a left turn. And we know that because we can see the lane markings there, and of course where the arrows are pointing, so it's okay and it's legal to use those lanes for those particular turns there, turning right or turning left. So, and of course, lots of times some intersections have traffic lights whereby we've got the flashing arrow to make right or left turns as well. So with the lane markings, class, plus the road signs or the traffic lights, that's our vocabulary, if you want. In other words, it's telling us what we can do or what we can't do, what's safe or what's not safe. So they talk about signalized intersections there on page 3 as well. And the second paragraph there to your left of the page there, you say whether stop first in line or in line of vehicles at a red signal that changes to green, a fresh green light. Use the count of 3, count 1, 2, 3 before moving. That may be a good idea, class, but and again, it depends on the driver that's behind you, waiting to move away. For example, if the light turns green and you're counting to 3 before you move, if the driver behind you is a bit aggressive or easy to have road rage, they might be leaning on the horn before you actually move away. So, well, it might be a good idea. I suggest that you always start to move ever so slowly, and that way they can see that, look, well, the car is moving, and the driver in front of you will already be gone across the intersection. So the idea of it there, what you're talking about, is to establish that 2-second following distance before you actually move away, and let that driver ahead of you be about 2 seconds away from you. And you'll establish your following distance right from the get-go, so to speak, right at the intersection there. So that's what you say, count to 3 before you actually move. It gives the driver in front of you time to get away from you in approximately a 2-second following distance. So that's the idea of it there. But like I'm saying, sometimes the driver behind you may not realize this and probably lean on the horn, and that's not nice, of course. I don't mean a toot now, but a long, loud blast. It indicates aggressiveness, right? So maybe you just move ever so slowly first and let that driver in front of you get away from you, which they will, no doubt. So that way you probably have, you will satisfy that driver behind you, that you're actually starting to move. But if you want to count to 3 and, before you move, that might be a good idea, you know, the driver behind you may understand and everything is okay. So it just depends on the situation, class, and what kind of drivers you're involved with there, I would say. So you can pretty well decide there what might be the best thing to do there. But they suggest that you count the tree before you move away there. It'll establish that following distance right from the get-go. That's the idea of it there. So on the next page there, they talk about time and space judgment there on page 4 of chapter 15. And I won't read all those paragraphs to you, but what that reading is telling us there, class, what it equates to is that if we're driving at 50 kilometers an hour, and I've mentioned before, if you're driving at 50 kilometers an hour, for example, you will travel 13.5 meters in 1 second. So that's what they're talking about there, driving at, crossing the street at 50 kilometers an hour, you will travel 81 meters there, you're noticing the second paragraph. So as I say, what that equates to is that a vehicle traveling, or a bicycle, or a motorcycle, could whatever vehicle may be, if it's traveling at 50 kilometers an hour, it'll go 13.5 meters. It's quite a distance in just 1 second. And that's just that around town speed pretty much, as we say there. They show you the stagger stop to that picture there to your right there on page 4. And you notice the little red car there is staying back from the stop line there. And of course that's because of those poor drivers that we mentioned earlier that's coming from the right, making the left turn, and they sweep across your the front of your vehicle. And I think we might have talked about that earlier, I'm sure, but I just want to point it out one more time there, if we can find it here. Yeah, this one here, for example, you know, when they're coming from the right, they're making a left turn, they sort of want to hog part of this lane here. So for that reason, that driver is staying back there, as shown you on the picture in your textbook there, maybe half a car length or 3/4 of a car length, and you get away from probably being involved with this particular car here and end up having a fender bender or bumper or bender, whatever you want to call it there. So that's the idea of that class, to stay back a bit from your stop line there. And that's what they're showing you there on page 4 of chapter 15 there. The stagger stop. And I mentioned before, a lot of our stop lines are already moved back for that same reason, actually. Maybe a car length or car length and a half in some cases. Talk about a right turn and squeeze there at the bottom of page 4, and you notice the truck there, that oil tanker, by the looks of things, it's a long truck anyway, in any event, and it's making a right turn there. You can see its signal lights are flashing to make a right turn there. So the driver in the red car is staying back maybe a couple of 3 car lengths there, you notice that? And helping that driver negotiate that turn there. Because when that truck is probably about halfway around that curve, that turn, it's going to be very close to the sidewalk there. It's just the way the turning radius works with a long vehicle. And if that car were right up to the stop line, like normally a lot of drivers would be, you know, they could easily be involved in a collision there with that truck, you know. So what that driver is doing, very courteous driver by the looks of things there, they're staying back that 2 or 3 car lengths and letting that truck make its right turn, and then of course they're going to probably lose a couple of 3 seconds of their day, but after all, they probably have prevented a collision as well. So that's what's happening there, class. That driver is very courteous, no doubt, in that red car there, and can realize what might happen there by observing and evaluating, remember, the OEA driving strategy. So, and if you were driving that truck, you would appreciate it if that driver did the same thing, I'm sure, you know, by staying back and letting me get around my turn there. And then, of course, like I'm saying, it's going to take a few seconds, but not much in a whole day, really. So it just shows courtesy, class, and observing and evaluating and then acting. And that's what that driver did there in the red vehicle, no doubt. So like I said, it could be you or me, we're driving a big truck sometime, and then, you know, the other driver's helping us maneuver our vehicle more safely. That's what it's about there, really. So nice picture there, it tells us a lot, really. So on page 5, they talk about the shared left turn lanes, and we've talked about these earlier. They're on at least Kenmount Road and Topsail Road, maybe other places, but certainly on those two roadways, they are heavily traveled roadways. And you can also see a left turn bay there, where there's a couple of arrows turning to the left there, and that's actually a part of the street that you get into, and so that while you're waiting to make your left turn, you're not hanging up any other traffic. So it's a left turn bay or a left turn lane if you want there. So, and of course they show you the arrows, as I say, for the shared left turn lanes as well on that picture there. And so you might be using these, I would say, many times for sure. In that shared left turn lanes, as I just want to mention too, and they mentioned there in the book, it's not a lane to get into and drive probably a half a kilometre or a quarter of a kilometre or whatever. It's just to, no more than 100 metres they suggest. It's just to get yourself into that lane while you're waiting to make your left turn. So, and in either direction you can use that lane to make a left turn as well. So that's the idea of it. Just get in there and use a few meters of it, and then of course you're stopped and you're going to wait to make that left turn as soon as it's safe to do so there. And I'll just read you that paragraph on page 5 there, to your right there. They say this third paragraph, they say, once you are certain it is safe, signal, then check again prior to entering the lane. Do not drive in this lane for a long distance. 100 meters would be a suggested maximum distance. Stop in the lane with the front tire straight ahead while waiting for a sufficient gap. And you mentioned here about keeping your tire straight ahead until the last second you're about to make that left turn test, because the thing about it, if sometimes, and we've said before that rear end collisions are fairly common. So if you were hit from the rear and you had your tires already turned partially to the left, you're probably going to be pushed out into the path of oncoming traffic. So that's why they're saying keep your tires straight, and the last second before you're about to make your left turn, then of course you would turn your wheels, your tires there. So I just want to mention that because it could save you sometimes from being involved in 2 collisions as opposed to 1. So if you get hit from the rear, I mean that's a collision, but then again if you're pushed into a lane of traffic coming, well then of course you're going to be involved, hit twice, 2 times, so you're going to be involved in 2 collisions if you want. So make sure that you keep your tires straight until you're just about ready to make your turn there, always. On page 6 again, they show you a picture of the roundabout, modern roundabout of chapter 15, page 6. And of course, we already talked about roundabouts last. Remember, we said, when you're entering a roundabout, it's always on a right turn. When you're leaving a roundabout or exiting a roundabout, it's on a right turn. And of course, you can't change lanes in a roundabout. It's illegal and it could be very dangerous. You can't reverse in a roundabout. You can't stop and back up your car. If you missed where you had to turn out to, you should go around the whole roundabout again, and the next time around you can move out into the lane that you're intended to travel on. So that's the thing about roundabouts. Usually speeds are much slower than out at the street that you came in on. So, not over 20 or maximum 30 kilometers an hour. So, and we also said that cars coming from your left when you're entering a roundabout, you don't have the right of way there. There's a yield sign in front of you, so they would have the right of way. Once you get into the roundabout, cars coming from your right have the yield. So when you're entering, cars coming from your left, they have the right of way. When you get in the roundabout, cars coming from your right has the yield, and you have the right of way. But just make sure that they're not going to try and squeeze out in front of you and sort of cut you off if you want, so just be wary of that for sure. Urban and rural comparison at the bottom of page 6 there of chapter 15. They talk about the characteristics to be wary of, and of course this is in the city now, or a big town where there's a lot of intersections, and they mentioned here a multitude of intersections, rows of parked vehicles that we have to watch out for, we've already talked about. Off-road parking, school buses, school and playground zones, changing speed limits, traffic jams, numerous traffic signals, city buses, delivery vehicles, and other vehicles that stop frequently, like mail trucks, for example. They stop every quarter of a kilometer or so to check the mailboxes or whatever. In rural areas outside of the city now, we have particular dangers like slow-moving vehicles, oncoming vehicles, large ones that produce air turbulence, off-road vehicles that could be skidoos or wintertime ATVs and side-by-sides and those types of things. Hidden intersections, crossings, railroad, animal trucks, etc. But hidden intersections and winding roads and hills, and that could be on, like, particularly on cabin roads or forest roads, farm roads, we have not likely to be paved. They're narrow in some cases, narrow bridges, steep hills, sharp turns, no doubt. So unpaved roads, as they mentioned here, narrow bridges that we just say here. Sometimes those bridges are so narrow that only one car can cross at a time. So whichever car gets to the entrance of the bridge first would naturally should be given the right of way to move across that bridge, and then of course you could move after. So a little bit different than city driving, no doubt about it, you know. They talk about curves again there, or turns in the road, or bends, whatever you want to call it. And they ask us on page 7 there, heading curves there. They say, how sharp is the curve? Are there any warning signs? Sometimes, as I say, there will be signs posted that say, look, you know, the speed limit is lower here now. So, you know, because the curve is quite sharp, instead of 70 or 80 kilometers an hour, they may have it down to 40, just to get yourself safely around that curve. And then you're back to the regular speed limit again, which might be, I don't know, 80, 90, 100, whatever the case might be there. So we mentioned inertia back in chapter 11, I think it was, when we talked about physics class, and inertia, you know, is a body in motion that tends to stay in motion until something stops it. So, and this is typical of what they show us here on that picture on page 7 of chapter 15 there, whereby a vehicle is approaching a curve, and if it's traveling too fast, it's going to want to keep on going straight, but you want it to turn. So sometimes that wouldn't work, you know, if you've got too much speed up on a turn, and you're trying to actually turn the vehicle itself, it doesn't want to go that way. So what we said, remember earlier, to slow down before you get to the turn, not when you get into it. That could be too late. So once you get your speed down, then of course you just accelerate, keep up that slow, steady speed, and steer the vehicle around the curve there. That's what they're showing us there on that picture there on page 7 of chapter 15 there. Speed and braking. So they talk about the slope of the road. If it's a flat bank road or crown road, the pavement and your line of sight, sign, sharpness of the curve, etc., are all factors. It is preferable to enter a curve more slowly. You can always accelerate. If you enter too fast, a loss of control will be inevitable. A lot of collisions occur on turns, on curves, because people usually, you know, the approach to getting to that turn, and they're at too high a speed, and our natural instinct sometimes is to get our foot on the brake, and it changes the imbalance of the vehicle, and more often than not, you're probably going to end up off the road, you know. So make sure that you get your speed down before you actually get to that particular turn in the roadway there. And they tell you lastly there on page 7 as well, that when they're talking about hazards, oncoming vehicles that may cross the center line, a closed line of sight, well, we can't see around a turn usually, and too much speed are hazards in every curve. Look ahead into the curve, never brake on the curve. Class, you know, as they say, we just mentioned, don't don't get your foot on the brake until your car slows down on its own. Then of course, once it gets to a much lower speed, you can brake gently if you have to. Braking puts extra stress on the front tires because, as we say, once you put your foot on the brake, that kinesthetic effect, remember that big word we talked about, realizing the motions of your vehicle? You put your foot on the brake, your vehicle, the weight is thrown to the front of the vehicle, and of course you've got more traction on the front tires to steer the vehicle. So they say braking puts extra stress on the front tires, weight transfers to one front corner. A blowout or loss of control could result. So not the time to brake on the curbs, that's when we have to want our vehicle to slow down. Just grip the steering wheel firmly, both hands of course always, and try and keep your vehicle in its lane there. So on page 8 there, they talk about hills of course, and the hills would be a closed line of sight. We can't see over hills. So, and they show you a picture there of a vehicle approaching a hill, going up a hill there, and you notice they have that picture, the line is solid there, like it should be, and it's not a broken line when you're approaching a hill. You will never see a broken line on the center line on the pavement. It's always a solid line there. So on hills, gravity affects the movement of your vehicle. Uphill reduces speed and shortens your braking distance. Remember we talked about that. If you're asking anything about braking distance, the shortest braking distance is approaching a hill. Not on the level or not going downhill, but going up a hill is the shortest braking distance. Shifting gears, uphill shift to a lower gear even with an automatic transmission. Actually there's no need of that class. Earlier they say the transmission will shift on its own. You don't have to shift it in an earlier chapter, and that's true. So, but of course with a standard transmission or a manual transmission vehicle, more often than not you would have to shift or you wouldn't have enough power to make that, to get up that particular hill there. So, so uphill shift to a lower gear with an automatic is not necessary, Cass, because you know it's an automatic and it'll shift on its own, and that's the idea of it. You know, if you put it in drive, that's what you do when you start off. And you can drive around the town or the city all day and hills, uphill or downhill or whatever. You don't have to bother shifting your transmission and your automatic transmission. Downhill, shift to a lower gear without pressing the accelerator, and the engine's compression will help control the speed so that you will not have to press the brake firmly. Well, in the case of a smaller cars, class like pickups, vans, and cars, you know, brake fade, as I mentioned, is not likely to happen. So we can use our brake more as opposed to heavy trucks that has to keep back a cargo, plus the truck's weight itself. You know, it's much different then. Those drivers will probably gear down or get to a lower gear so that the engine's compression can help the truck keep it back. But in the case of pickups and vans, cars, it's highly unlikely we're ever going to experience our brakes overheating, because it's a lighter vehicle. We don't have to brake as hard, and it's not likely that the brakes are going to overheat, and that's what brake fade is, of course, overheating of the brakes. So probably we wouldn't have to worry about that particular thing there as opposed to big trucks. The visibility and speed there, and you notice the cars approaching a hill, and you don't know what's on the other side of the hill yet. There may be something there may not. But it's a closed line of sight, so you would keep over to the right and reduce your speed, of course. And once you get to the top of the hill, you can see if there's any hazard there or not. And in this case, it looks like a slow-moving little farm tractor probably that's headed down the hill. So that would be the hazard to you, to us then as a driver, of course. That little tractor there is not going to be moving at 80 or 90 kilometers an hour for sure. So we have to be ready for any hazard that might be on the opposite side of the hill there. Actually, they talk about brake failure or overheating that I just mentioned there. And as I said, as I've mentioned several times in the past, with smaller vehicles, brake fade or overheating is probably not going to happen because we're not using our brakes with that much pressure to stop the car or slow it down. And so brake fade is probably highly unlikely with a car or a pickup or vans or whatever. But, you know, bigger trucks, yes, it's quite possible that sometimes they experience brake fade and they have to get themselves off the road safely and let the brakes cool down. You know, it's just the way friction works. As we said before, friction builds up heat. So, you know, and when it gets so hot, they sort of glaze, and of course they don't hold the vehicle back too much. So then of course they have to wait and let the vehicle, let the temperature of the drums and the brake shoes and everything cool down somewhat. Passing or being passed, of course, and as they say there, passing is one of the more dangerous driving maneuvers, and indeed it is there. Before passing, you must decide whether it makes sense under the existing road, traffic and weather conditions, your speed of the vehicle, and the speed limit are major factors there. Whether or not passing permitted by law, you have to take into consideration your line of sight and the situation ahead. You know, when the vehicle ahead is driving at least 10 kilometers an hour slower than both your speed and the speed limit, and the maneuver can be performed safely and legally, you might come to the decision that you should pass. So, you know, once in a while, yes, if the vehicle in front of you, probably the engine may not be working the way it should, or the driver could be a bit nervous or tired or whatever, and they're going at a much slower speed than the actual speed limit. And if it's ideal driving, as we've said, dry pavement, clear day, not a lot of traffic, and you know, light winds, you might decide to pass that particular vehicle there. So on the bottom of page 9, class, they're showing you a scenario there whereby a driver might be deciding to pull out and pass another vehicle. The blue vehicle there, for example, is looking ahead at the red car in front of them there, and they're certainly using their eyes like they should be there for signs and signals and observing, we say, and evaluating. So the first thing that driver can see there ahead is that little cross at the bottom of page 9 there, right over to your right there. That means there's an intersection just up ahead. Plus they're looking in the next lane there, and you can see that there's a motorcycle in that particular lane. Plus they can see that there's another car coming on the road from, as I say, it could be from a gravel pit or a forestry road or cabin road or whatever. And of course they're also looking behind the vehicle. You can see that arrow there, area 6, directly behind the vehicle. And they're using their rear view mirror, obviously there. And they're certainly using their side view and their eyes, because the arrow's coming off from the left side of the vehicle there, in the lane that they're hoping to move out into. So the thing about it is that driver actually going to attempt to make a pass there. You know, there's an intersection, there's a motorcycle in the lane coming toward them, there's another car coming onto the roadway. So, you know, those three things there would tell us that, you know, it's not even you shouldn't even consider making a pass there, because it would be too dangerous. So, as they mentioned here, they talk about observing, scanning, and identifying. You know, is it safe to do so? What could happen here? You know, that sort of thing. So on page 10 there, they talk about passing, of course, because as I say, passing is always an element of danger. And it looks like this driver is doing a good job there. They have their signal lights on. The blue car is passing the red vehicle there. So the driver has their signal lights on there, and they're moving out about a 2-second following distance approximately before they reach that vehicle. You wouldn't go right up to the rear of that car and then pull out, because at that point part of your vision would be blocked by the car itself. You probably can't see over it, you wouldn't be able to see around it because you're too close to it. So you would pull out about a 2-second following distance before you get to that vehicle. Plus, once you get out and pass that vehicle, you pass it, and when you get about approximately a 2-second following distance past it, you look in your rear view mirror and you can see the whole vehicle that you passed. Then of course you have to get your signal light on to make a right turn again, because you're pulling into a right lane there, right? So then of course you have to get your signal light on, and always before you pull in, shoulder check, look over your right shoulder. Now you're pulling into a right lane there, so look over your right shoulder, make sure that that lane is clear and that car didn't sneak up on you when you're about to move back in your lane again there. So you should be watching for that type of thing, class, when you're passing. 2-second following distance before you get to the vehicle, pull out, and you will be about a 2-second following distance past that vehicle before you should move into your lane again there. So on the bottom of page 10 there, they talk about a loss of following distance, and we saw a picture similar to that one earlier. I don't know what speed you're doing here, but it looks like that the blue vehicle is much too close to the vehicle in front of them there. So loss of following distance, that would be a tailgater, we could call it another term to use there. So on page 11, they talk about oncoming vehicle passes there, and you notice they're approaching a hill and the line is broken in this case again. That should really be a solid line there. In any event, the car popped over the hill and trying to get around a truck there, passing a truck, and there's another driver coming up the hill there. So that could be the result of a head-on collision there. As we said, we don't know what speed you're doing there, but that driver approaching the hill is going to have to get out of the way there for sure. Or maybe the driver in the red car can slow down and fall back in behind that vehicle again, that truck there, you know, depending on what's the best scenario there to actually perform in that case there. But in any event, rather than be involved in a head-on collision, that driver may have to drive themselves, that car, right off the road into the embankment there or into the trees, whatever the case might be there, to avoid a head-on collision. So they say passing in the law on page 11 as well, to your right there. You may not pass another vehicle on the left of a 2-lane roadway or in the center lane of a 3-lane road unless the lane is clearly visible and is free of oncoming traffic. And that makes a lot of good sense there, of course. You have to see well ahead before you pull out into traffic to make a pass. And of course, and I just want to mention too, class, on the board there again. For example, let's assume that this red car here wants to pass the blue vehicle, and they look down the roadway here, of course, and you can see there's no car coming, that's fine. But before you actually pull out to make your pass, always note the side of the road, class, whereby there's farm roads and cabin roads and forestry roads, or in gravel pits sometimes, that there's somebody not poking out here to get on this lane as well. So when you pull out, you want to make sure, observe the sides of the road, as well as farther down the roadway, and make sure that there's no traffic coming either from this direction, from a cabin road or farm road, as we've said, and certainly not in this lane here coming toward you, or it's quite a distance away, whatever. Just be watchful and wary of that, class, because once in a while, particularly summer times, you know, people are around parked in gravel pits and they're coming out of their cabin roads and farm roads and that sort of thing. So just be wary of that when you pull out to make a pass another vehicle here. Because passing is always an element of danger, as we say here. So passing on the left is prohibited when you must cross a solid yellow line. It's not allowed. That's why that line is solid, class. It's not safe if for some reason or another you're too near the curb, or you're too near a hill, or too near a turn in the roadway, whatever. Approaching hill or curb when your view ahead is obstructed. Within 30 meters off a bridge or a viaduct, that would be an overpass, a viaduct, or a tunnel. Oncoming traffic is too close and you cannot see clearly ahead. You know, weather conditions, fog, rain, snow, our visibility is greatly reduced, right? So you probably can't see far enough ahead to negotiate a safe pass. Passing on the right on a one-way roadway, divided highway, passing other vehicles on either side is permitted. And that's the one we looked at there, 4, 5, 6 lanes, all going in the same direction. You can pass to the right or left of that particular type of highway, roadway, whatever. So lastly there on page 12 of chapter 15 there, you notice there's a vehicle overtaking or passing another vehicle there right up at the top of the page, page 12 there. And the red vehicle, the wine color vehicle, whatever, is passing the blue vehicle. And of course, next to that there to your right, there's a picture as well whereby there's a green vehicle passing a blue vehicle, SUVs by the look of it there. But you notice in the left lane from that blue vehicle there's a motorcycle approaching, and the driver in the green vehicle may not have time to get ahead of that blue vehicle before they're involved with that motorcyclist there. So the driver in the blue vehicle is very courteous, probably, and a defensive driver, obviously. So what they did there, at the bottom picture there, halfway down the page to your right, the driver in the blue vehicle, it looks like they're making an abrupt stop. Hopefully they check the rear view mirror first, just to see that you weren't being tailgated. So assuming everything was okay behind that vehicle, there's no car close to them, they're making an abrupt stop and letting that green vehicle get in front of them to save having probably a head-on collision with that motorcyclist there. So that's good thinking there, class, you know, and that defensive driver in that blue vehicle has probably saved somebody's life or a couple of lives or more there. Just by thinking and observing and evaluating, class, is what it's all about, you know. What can happen here, what should I do, and what's the best way out, in other words. So that's what's happening there. That driver in the blue vehicle is certainly doing a just cause there to help that driver that probably misjudged the speed of that motorcycle, or they're closer than they thought they were, you know. So passing, class, is always, like I say, you always have to judge and make sure that how fast that vehicle is traveling and how much distance you have to work with, and watching other cars coming onto the roadway once in a while. So things to look out for when we're attempting to make a pass. I just want to mention this one here, class, too, on the chart here with regards to the passing. Some years ago, many years ago, maybe a couple of decades now, I could say, this passing lane here, this is actually a passing lane on our highways here. We have a lot of those across the Newfoundland even, and those signs, center lane must yield and keep right except to pass. The right lane is the driving lane, class. This is in Canada, we drive to the right. But we have a lot of passing lanes whereby drivers can get in and pass you or me if we're, even sometimes if we're going speed limit. Other drivers will want to move a bit faster, and it's illegal, of course, but they do it as people. Everybody is different, I suppose. So they may want to drive a bit faster, so they may want to pass me or you here coming up in this lane. And so they're right around here and just using this passing lane. When they get here, class, to exit or going out of the passing lane, there used to be, some years ago, a big yield written across here, whereby this driver in the passing lane, if a car is moving out here, this driver here should actually wait or yield to them. But lots of times, maybe drivers, they have that me first attitude and they're going on through anyway, and there's usually traveling at a high speed at this area here, because they've already passed me or you here. So by the time they get here, they're going to be traveling at a fairly high speed. So years ago, as I've said, yield sign will be written across here, yield. And of course, by the time the winter was halfway through, with road clearing and salt and sand on the road, this writing here would be scraped away and it wouldn't be visible. So engineers said, well, that doesn't work, we got to do something about it. So they put these road signs here that's more durable and can stand for years, actually. The center lane must yield. And the center lane is always this one next to the yellow line here. So it says center lane must yield. So what they're saying, that vehicle that passed you and me here, we're here, let's assume, and this vehicle here passed us on the roadway, right here. By the time they get up here, they should actually yield to any car that's moving out here, class, you know. But don't always take it for granted, because it may not be the case. They may not be planning on slowing down or waiting for me or you to get out here into the single lane again. So just be wary of that there, Tess, because, right here could be an area of conflict, and it could be a very serious collision, because, it's usually high speed, and of course the higher the speed, the greater the chance of more serious injury or death, God forbid. So just be extra cautious of that, Tess. Legally, you would have the right of way here, no doubt about it, by law. But just don't assume that other drivers are going to obey this sign here, center lane must yield. So just make sure, just be extra cautious and watch the other driver. Observe, remember we talked about so much, and say, look, what would happen here? And evaluate, and what's the risk? Could I be involved in a collision? And, so those are things to remember there when we're involved with passing, class, whether it be in a passing lane, or if it's just on a two-way roadway such as this one here. Other cars coming toward us, other cars coming from different directions, from gravel pits or forestry roads or whatever. Something to keep in mind, because, if you're involved in those collisions there on roadways passing, they're usually high speed, so they could be very serious. So that's about it for chapter 15, class, when it comes to urban and rural environment. So pay attention to what we've talked about there, and that's what you mentioned at the first of the page there, curves and passing, first of the chapter rather. So make sure that you, and hills, of course, we have some of those, particularly on forestry roads and cabin roads, and even on the highway sometimes we have hills, of course, and passing and being passed. So be very cautious in those particular areas. So that's it for chapter 15.